You hear that? It sounds like questions.
Could it be
Another
community
hot take.
It's that time of the week where we basically start talking about questions that you've sent us that we haven't looked at before.
That's confusing.
Yeah.
We're answering questions?
Yes.
Okay.
We're getting questions sent in from you, folks all over on Twitter, on
Yes.
YouTube, Facebook, wherever. And our producer has picked up the questions. We don't know what they are, and they're thrown at us, and then we have to answer them as quick as we can.
This sounds frightening.
Yes, it is.
Yes, this during our Q&As, it's a little more loosey-goosey. You know, we nothing. We're never scripted per se,
Yeah.
but we like to undo the tie a little bit.
A little
here.
bit, right.
Are we gonna answer some of these things?
I think we
You
are. So,
suckers?
are we ready
What's
for the
going on?
first question?
Okay, so the first question. Let's bring it up. From SNES-tastic. Only gaming topic I'm interested in right now is the Intellivision Amico. Any chance of a hot take on that trailer they put out a while back showing the gameplay?
You know.
I have for you, because I don't know the last time you saw it.
Okay, let's bring it
Oh
up.
yeah, bring up the Amico.
Yeah.
The Amico trailer. I think this is from August.
Yeah.
I was watching this a little
This is-
earlier this week.
Yeah, so we didn't talk about this when it came out. So for those of you that don't know, we actually interviewed Tommy Tellerico, who's actually in charge of this.
Yep.
And look, there is a lot of interesting things on play here, and there's a lot of interesting games being shown off. But the real situation of it is that it doesn't look all that different than what you can get right now with already existing systems. And even if the price is cheap, well, the controller is likely not going to be that good, which we also saw, and that didn't look so hot.
Yeah, everything, all the messaging that seems to be coming out from that team, of course, is glowing, and they're saying, no, the technology is amazing, and it's going to revolutionize. Their wording is very specific. It's like familial entertainment,
Yeah,
like family
yeah.
entertainment, and that's what they keep saying, is that it's going to bring people together and the family together in the living room again. But I feel like the messaging of this box is so off. Like, is it for families of 2019, or is this more for people that grew up with the original Intellivision from like the late 1970s, early 1980s? Like,
Yeah.
you would assume it would be like retro freaks that just love like retro games and stuff, and maybe an audience like us or slightly older. But then the messaging is, no, this is for moms and dads and grandma and grandpa and the kids, just like the Wii. But then we're seeing Echo the Dolphin,
Yes.
what seems to be an Echo the Dolphin game.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing
Earthworm Jim, for sure.
Earthworm Jim's
Yeah.
gonna like. Are those mom and dad games?
You know,
I don't know.
It's so confusing to me because like the problem I'm having right now is, you're right, the messaging is all over the place, and in my opinion, it looks like what Tommy and his team at Intellivision are trying to do is make a brand new system that is essentially the board game for the modern family. So it's like, it's going to have controllers that have an easy-to-use interface because they're basically touchscreen phones, but they do have some physical buttons, but just a little bit different. It's weird to see this system being designed the way it is and being implemented the way it is, because we thought that it was going to be one thing. Seeing the games, we're seeing very simple, and by the way, those games you saw are apparently going to be sold very, very cheap. So super cheap games delivered either digitally or physically.
Mostly digitally.
Mostly digitally, with controllers that, by the way, if you need to play with more controllers and you don't have them, you can just use your cell phone, download an app, and use that. So how does that actually work?
Is someone at more of an advantage because they have some physical buttons on the side that they can make use of, and then the people using the phones? There's so many questions that are still up in the air. Do I want to see this succeed? Of course I do.
Of course,
anything within the realm of video games, I want to see great things come out of. I don't want to bash this thing.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I just think, like I said, right now the messaging is really off, and I don't necessarily see anything that's super appealing to myself.
Well, see, that's the thing. I don't think if you're out there and you think this is really cool, awesome, but I actually don't think it's aiming towards us. I think it's aiming towards our parents, our grandparents. It's aiming towards people that literally do not play video games as a daily hobby. So if you're watching Hot Take, chances are you probably care about video games quite a bit.
Yeah.
So that's not really aimed at you. From what we can tell, it really seems to be aimed at a group of people that want more simplified games.
But the things that are making the headlines are like, it's folks like us and the people out there that are like, whoa, is that Echo? Whoa, Earthworm Jim's coming to this. Oh, you know, it was Shark? I think Shark. Shark's coming to this thing. That's a great game.
Yeah, it's one that many people may not really know. See, it's that kind of messaging that gets really confusing and really weird. Hands down, I think that Tommy Tallarico is really smart. He's done a lot of things in the past. He's one of the most, important people when it comes to the video game soundtracks of our youth and of the modern era.
Video games as a whole.
Yeah.
He has his whole live show and stuff as
Right,
well.
yeah.
So he's very passionate about this, but we have to wait until it's released. I think it's in 2020, right? It should be, unless it's like pushed back for
If
some
anyone's
reason.
going to make
10-10-2020.
Yeah,
It was 10-10-2020.
If anyone's going to make this a success and prove everyone wrong, it's going to be Tommy Tallarico.
Yep.
So we'll see how it goes, but I'm on uneven ground here. I personally don't think it's going to be a success, but a success for us as gamers, it might find a completely different market, and that's where it will live.
All right, next question.
Okay, let's bring it up. The next question is from Krenis. With next-gen consoles being closer to PCs, do you think consoles will be phased out and move to PCs the following generation?
Ah, yes. PC Master Race. Ah, you and me. No, see, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think consoles are going to stay around for a really, really long time.
I think it's because there's so many people that are still like all of their entertainment is in their living room, right?
That's true.
And I believe consoles speak to me like absolutely. Whenever there's a PC topic kind of bubbling up, you're always the one that like really wants to tackle it right away. And I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, let's talk about PC stuff. But home consoles have always been my jive. I always know that when I pick up titles for a home console game, the way that they play on that console is going to be the same way across the board everywhere. With PCs, there's a bunch of different variables. For me, it's a lot of fun to collect for console. It's the ecosystem that I like. I feel like it's a little more well curated.
Sure.
It's a little less of a Wild West, though. That's a little dubious recently with more of the indie games popping up, but I still feel like it's a pretty curated.
Honestly, folks, as weird as this is going to sound, you give somebody a bag of rocks, they'll find a way to make a game out of it, really. And that's how people kind of exist in this world. So when you think about console games, there's always going to be a device that people are going to want to play games on.
Mm-hmm.
Their TV makes sense. You're going to want to play games on your TV because it really is the central focus of the living room. Here's where it gets a little bit more complex, though, because the concept of PCs like surpassing consoles has sort of happened already, because PlayStation 4 and Xbox One kind of are PCs.
Yeah, and I mean, what do you mean by I mean, PCs have surpassed consoles for a super long time as far as like their power and everything is concerned. We've had the ability to take a PC and hook it up to a TV, no problem, but that still has not been the that has not clicked with the general public en masse. It's more the PC centric person already.
What I'm a little bit of what I'm saying is, no matter what it is, what kind of interface it's going to be, people are going to want to play games on it. Mm-hmm. Bag of rocks, microwave, fridge. Doesn't matter. People will find a way where there's life. Okay, so there's this idea, though, that PCs are a little bit too complex and difficult for the average consumer to get into en masse. We have a lot of people out there that own PCs and laptops and stuff, but realistically, I don't think PCs are ever going to reach the super mainstream that consoles do, because it's a cheaper investment. The games are straightforward and easy to understand, and what's very important is the interface. You might not think about it nowadays, but how many kids are growing up right now that don't know how to use a mouse? That should freak you out a little bit, but it's the fact of life right now. Most kids grow up and they know how to use a touchscreen interface before they know how to use a keyboard and a mouse, and that's legitimately how things are going.
Perfect for the Amico.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the keyboard and mouse, it's going to be a little bit difficult. We have friends that refuse to play first-person shooters on anything but a controller, because a controller to them is a lot easier. I grew up on a keyboard and mouse, so it made a lot more sense to me to transition from that to a controller and back and forth. But that's just the way it is. Yeah. The simplest way to play a game will always be the easiest, and consoles will seemingly always be more simple than a PC.
If anything, it'll be a super long time, because as far as most of the populace is concerned, especially like the older folks, you talk about gaming in the living room, and like the first thing that will pop up in their mind is PlayStation or Nintendo, whatever. You know, my grandma calls everything a Nintendo, or even Xbox to an extent. PC has not yet become that, and if it is going to surpass consoles and be in the living room, it's going to take several generations. I'm not even 2 or 3, I don't believe.
Yeah. All right. Next question.
Okay. We have Joe Majeski with an interesting thing. Alternate timeline. Nintendo releases the N64 as a disc-based system. What changes?
Technically, wasn't the DD a disc?
Yeah.
But a different spelling of disc.
Yeah. You're basically, okay, we're going to assume you're talking about CD-ROMs. There is actually a CD-ROM drive for the Nintendo 64 where you can back up your games and actually play them off the disc. I forgot what that was called, the Doctor? Or
I'm not sure.
Doctor?
You're on your own here, man.
It was like not very popular, although they do command quite a price nowadays if you can find one. Okay. This is a really, really good question because I've always theorized that the N64 could have been a bigger success for Nintendo had certain features been changed around. The disk drive was a big one because that drove a lot of publishers and developers away from making games on the N64 because of the limitation of the cartridge size. I believe the cartridge size on the N64 can be at most 64 megabytes. Funny enough, but when it comes to CD-ROMs, you were dealing with 700 megabytes. So a game could have a lot more features in it and didn't have to be compressed down so much. Despite the fact the N64 is actually a far more powerful system than the PlayStation, there was just two things that really didn't work for it.
Yep.
The cartridge and the RAM. There simply wasn't enough RAM. They didn't put enough in there, and that memory really hampered the way that people develop games on the platform. So honestly, if you really think about it, having that disk drive would have mattered, but I think they would have they would have needed to have a little bit of extra RAM to just add on to that because at the time the chip they were using was actually more powerful than PCs,
Right.
and that could have been a huge gamble. Like a whole bunch of people out there would have been like, okay, I either spend so much money on a 3D graphics card, and by the way, at the time, people really weren't buying 3D graphics cards for their PC because it was just the thing you didn't do. You bought the computer, it had video out, you wouldn't buy an additional card to do video out that only worked on a handful of games. So having the N64 have all that ability built in and be cheaper than a PC would have really set it apart.
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much more to say than what you've already said. So it's a disc-based system. Let's say it has like all the RAM in the world.
Sure.
Nintendo was they're still kind of having problems with third-party support. And we did see like disc-based media for like the GameCube and stuff, and that console itself still struggled. I mean, if you want to look at a disc-based Nintendo product that didn't do all that well, you can look at that, or you can look at the Wii U. It's not necessarily like it's not necessarily the medium that the game is being played off of that makes a console a huge success or not. It's whether or not third-party developers want to jump on board, as far as like a billion other things are concerned. So I'm not sure. Like what the question was, would the N64 be like? Would it have been better if it was disc-based?
What would have happened? Like I think we would have seen a lot more games because the cartridges would have been are way more expensive than the discs.
Right. Oh, we would have seen a heck of a lot more FMV incorporated into our games. We would have seen a lot more like the sound of the N64 would have been far different. Maybe third-party support would have been more of a thing because we've heard tales of like the SquareSoft folks jumping off because of the problems with the medium. And then, of course, going to the PlayStation with Final Fantasy VII, which was a huge sort of kick.
We definitely would have seen a lot more games that were being developed for PlayStation transfer over to the Nintendo 64 because you would have had an easier way to transition that stuff. But realistically, you could transition games from the PlayStation over to the N64. It was just hard.
Resident Evil 2.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Mega Man Legends.
Yeah, they found a way. It's just they put a lot
Tony Hawk Pro Skater.
Yes. There were ways to do it. It's just, it was hard. I guess the best way to think about this, too, is it's not like they were the only console or the system to come out around the time that was moving from cartridges to discs. Saturn did it, right? Saturn was a really powerful system for 2D graphics. It had a lot of really cool stuff going on. It used discs, but it wasn't a success. Maybe the same thing would have happened to Nintendo.
You can be on a disc, but if it's very difficult to develop for that platform, great bringing up the Sega Saturn. Yeah, notoriously horrible to develop for that because they kind of shoved in another processor in the last minute, right? So. Yeah, there's so many other things that pop up in the air. I would have loved to have seen what would have happened back then if Nintendo was very CD focused.
Jeez, it would have been weird because in order for them to make a CD, they would have had to work with a company like Sony, most likely.
Yeah.
They'd already burnt their bridges with so many other companies up to this point. Whether you know about it or not, Nintendo was so bad with working with companies at that point in time that people really didn't like them. Sony hates Nintendo. The whole reason Sony is in the video game industry to begin with is because of what Nintendo had done to them. Philips got burned by them and a couple of other companies too. Yeah. So realistically, they would have been kind of hard to find someone to make that disc. But even if they did get a disc drive in the N64, how about Mario 64 with loading times? Yeah, see that probably would have been a little bit not so great.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why they didn't jump on board with that media
Yeah.
as well,
The
because they were
games
like,
were
no,
small.
we don't want loading times.
Yeah.
The games are small, but hey, if you want to develop for our system, you're gonna do it the way we want you to.
Yeah, I think we would have seen a very different thing, but maybe Nintendo may have been worse off. As weird as the N64 is, they had some interesting ideas. They went into it with both hands.
They stuck to it.
Yeah,
they
they're
stuck
like,
to it.
we're gonna be here for a while,
All right.
and they did.
Next question.
Yeah.
The next one will be our last question of the episode.
Last
Okay.
question of the episode. Better be a good one. Is it about chocolate?
Kenny Mensner, do you think the Sega had better versions of games than the SNES?
Ooh.
And I guess I have to assume Sega Genesis, right? If you're doing a Super Nintendo.
No.
But yeah.
I can go all Sega. There are some games on other Sega platforms that are better, especially, let's just say, Dreamcast to N64. I know that's not a fair comparison, but the Dreamcast has some of the best versions of games released for that era, like Vigilante 8 Second Offense. The best version of that game exists on the Dreamcast, even surpasses the PlayStation release. But when it comes to what I think you're asking, is the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games better one way or the other?
Oh my gosh. So, okay, the Genesis was released, I believe, in '89, and it was kind of sort of competing at the tail end of the NES.
Yeah.
And the Super Nintendo, they had a longer time to cook with that hardware. So I often feel like a lot of the games that were released on multiple platforms, my experience is better with them on the SNES, but there's some great Genesis titles that aren't even ports. Like you can look at games like the Contra games that were released, like we had Contra Hardcore and we had Contra the Alien Wars.
That's right.
Releasing on separate platforms, and like I think Contra Hardcore is better. But like similar games, like a lot of people will vouch for Earthworm Jim, for example. Soundtrack sounds completely different on both platforms. A lot of people like that Genesis crunchiness with their Earthworm Jim.
Yeah, there are legitimately completely different versions of games, like the Aladdin and stuff like that.
Yeah.
For
it's
one
another
version or the other.
yeah.
You know, I think the best way to think about this is, if I'm gonna be a jerk about this because I'm a Sega kid. I grew up playing Sega.
Yeah, I was
okay?
Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
So the perfect.
Super Nintendo is the better system.
Oh!
The hardware is just better.
It is.
It's because it's a newer system. There's no going around it, folks. One system was from the 80s, the other system was from the 90s. Things had progressed. But one thing that they did with the Super Nintendo that was really smart, and I'm not even going to get into Mode 7 because that was a really cool implementation in and of itself. I'm talking about the fact that they could bypass like circuitry into the cartridge so that they could have Super Effects chip stuff. Right? You could get a lot of games to run on the Sega Genesis, but they really had to be done in a very specific way to work that way.
Yeah.
And I think that there's just the variety of things that Super Nintendo was capable of doing without the need for extended hardware is pretty interesting.
And Sega, you could tell that Sega was dabbling with that extended hardware because of the capabilities of things like the Super FX chip, because we did have
the SVP.
Yeah, we had the chip that was in was it Virtua Racing?
Yep.
Yeah, and then we also had the other add-ons as well, which you could argue were trying to maybe compete against what the Super FX chip was doing. The Sega CD, of course, and the 32X. They almost feel like, I know they are the same generation to many people, but it seems like one did have a lot more time to cook, and I would say that a lot of the ports on the Super Nintendo I find to be a lot better. But there's still, like, it all depends on the developers, right?
It really does.
If you get a really great developer, I love Treasure.
Sure.
Like Treasure, who looks at the Sega Genesis and says, I can make a really great shooting game using the processing power of this machine. And like Gunstar Heroes, for example, it plays beautifully and wonderfully, and it can compete so well against many shooters that are released on the Super Nintendo.
I'm like, to be fair with it all, the system that has the most impressive games for that tech limitation for its time, I would have to say that the Sega Genesis overall, with its additions, right? The 32X and the Sega CD are not separate systems. They are accessories to that system. They only work when you hook them up to a Sega Genesis. And Sega CD games are so amazing. At the very end of that lifespan, you get graphics and visual quality that you don't see anywhere else.
Now that you bring that up, I have to weigh that. I'm just weighing the two like bare bones consoles. Now I'm a huge proponent of the Sega CD.
Sure, yeah.
I love me some RPGs. The Super Nintendo has some of the greatest RPGs of all time. Final Fantasy VI is maybe like the greatest RPG, 2D RPG ever made. But then the Sega CD, you had Lunar. You know I'm a big fan of Lunar.
Oh, yeah.
Lunar 2, Eternal Blue. You had Vey. Popful Mail
Sure.
has a lot of great FMV stuff going on there
Yes,
too.
it does.
I don't know, man. Are we supposed to come to a conclusion of what's better?
You know, there are several factors here.
It's so difficult.
The Super Nintendo by itself, because they never really added additional things to it,
Yeah.
like a disc drive or anything like that. At least, you know.
Well,
until
we
Sony.
know about that.
But like that, the Super Nintendo by itself is a far more superior system. The Sega Genesis had better add-ons and additions to make the system even better than it was.
Mm-hmm.
But when you compare those two libraries, it can go either way. Out of This World or Another World,
Mm-hmm.
that game is better on the Sega Genesis. Period. If you play it on the Super Nintendo, there's actual, no joke, loading times. Because apparently they were supposed to use a Super FX chip, but they didn't. So they ended up making it like a really bad version on the Super Nintendo.
Okay, so the port on Super Nintendo is worse in your opinion.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, that's-
And that can happen, right? But it also goes the other way. There can be a game that was released on one system that's better. There is no definitive answer here, and a lot of it is up to speculation and own personal preference.
Yeah, absolutely, and it depends, like I said, on what those developers are doing with that hardware. At the end of the day, that's all that matters. You can have the weakest system in the world, but someone can come along and make a Tetris,
Yes.
and it takes the world by storm,
It absolutely
and it
does.
becomes a brilliant platform.
Yeah. Like, there are a whole bunch of racing games on the Sega Genesis, but when you think about that era and the best racing games ever, you're probably thinking Mario Kart, you know? Like, that's just how that works. It's just two different systems that have completely different abilities, and that's what made that fight so interesting for its time.
We're still fighting to this day, so I don't know if it's a question that'll ever be answered, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
Well, folks, thank you so much for sending in your questions. Now, we are going to try and do this every week, like we said last week. So if you have any questions, write them in the comments below. Send them in on Twitter at Rerez TV or at Team Rerez is our new Twitter account.
Yeah, however you can get to us, send us some questions, and we'll do this. We'll keep this up. We like talking to you guys. Give us questions.